Welcome back to D&D Academy, where we teach you how to play Dungeons & Dragons. My name is Paul, and I'm the Dungeon Master here at House of Crit. And on today's episode, we're going to start to dive into the actual rules of the game. Even a casual flip-through of the player's handbook can be daunting, so we're going to handle all of this one step at a time. For today, we're going to go over the most important rules of D&D, the rules from which the entire game is balanced around. The core rules. In 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which is the current edition that you'll find in stores, and the one that most people are playing right now, has a set of rules that make up the core of the game. The good news is that there are only 6 core rules that make up the game. Just 6. Pretty straightforward, easy to remember rules. The bad news, however, is that they're found in Chapter 1 of the player's handbook, and most people skip right over them. To be fair, the fun stuff is found in the other chapters of the book, so I don't really blame anyone for wanting to get to the good stuff, but like everything in life, skipping the fundamentals always leads to unnecessary difficulties later. Now, for many of you out there, you probably know some, most, or probably all of the rules, but my goal is to be as thorough as possible and not leave anyone behind here. So let's go ahead and get started. The first of the core rules is that D&D is a D20 system. Everything in the game that requires a roll of the dice to determine success or failure will use a D20. The other dice might come into play as a result of the D20 roll, but when in doubt, and unless otherwise specified, the D20 is the die to use. The second rule is the advantage-disadvantage rule. There are situations in the game where a character is in a favorable position to attempt to do something. An example of this would be using a crowbar to pry up a gate instead of merely trying to lift it bare-handed. When in a favorable position, the character has what is called advantage. What this means is when that player makes their D20 roll to determine success or failure, they get to roll the D20 twice and keep the higher of the 2 rolls. However, there are also times when a character is in unfavorable conditions for their attempt, like trying to spot a far-off enemy in a heavy rainstorm. In unfavorable conditions, the character is at what is called disadvantage, which means that the player rolls the D20 twice and must keep the lower of the 2 results. Sometimes there are factors that would give a character both advantage and disadvantage at the same time. Let's say the ranger is following a set of footprints in the freshly fallen snow, which would give them advantage, but it's also started to snow quite heavily, which would give them disadvantage. In a situation where a character has both advantage and disadvantage, they cancel each other out, leaving the character at a single roll of the D20. Additionally, they don't stack. If your character has advantage for more than one reason, you only have advantage on the roll. There's no such thing as double advantage, unfortunately. But same goes for disadvantage. And the cancellation, if you happen to have both, still occurs, no matter how many sources of advantage or disadvantage that you have. Having 2 sources of advantage, but 1 source of disadvantage still cancels out the whole thing, once again, leaving you at a single roll of the D20. After that, the third rule is thankfully quite simple. It doesn't happen very often, but if you ever have to divide a number in the game, such as taking only half damage from an attack that you've dodged, you always round down, no matter what. Division always means round down every single time in the game. The fourth rule of D&D is about how the mechanics of the game work, and that is that specific beats general. What this means is that there are general rules to the game, and then there are exceptions to these rules under specific conditions. Here's a good example of this. As a general rule, a character can't walk through a solid wall. Makes sense, right? However, there are spells in the game that can let a character pass through a wall. This is a specific exception that breaks the general rule of the game. Now, this is the rule that makes D&D seem far more complicated than it actually is. In fact, the majority of the player's handbook is how specific instances break the general rules of the game. Thankfully, each character only has a few instances where their specific abilities override the general rules, so it doesn't become too overwhelming. The 5th rule of the game is a big one. It gets missed or overlooked, and that is only the Dungeon Master ever calls for a roll of the dice. The players never call for a roll, or roll without being prompted to. This is so that the DM can keep the tone, pace, and verisimilitude of the artificial reality of the game's story intact. What players do is tell the DM their intention for what they want their characters to do, and then the DM decides if a roll of the dice is even needed. Sometimes the players want their characters to attempt to do something either mundane or trivially easy for their character, so the DM would simply narrate the outcome in a successful manner. No dice are needed. Other times, the player wants their character to attempt to do something utterly impossible, and again, no die roll would be needed, as there would be no chance of success. The D20 is only used if there's an actual chance of success or failure. Finally, the sixth rule of D&D is that the Dungeon Master has final say on the rules at the table. Dungeons & Dragons has what is called a rule set instead of strict rules. This means that the rules have a large amount of flexibility to them, so they can be adapted to fit an infinite amount of situations. It is the DM's job to know the rules well enough to adapt them to the situations of the game at their table. However, this can create situations where different interpretations of the rules can come into conflict. Because of this, the DM is empowered to make the deciding call on the rules. Previous editions of D&D got bogged down in endless volumes of rules in a vain attempt to articulate and codify every possible situation and scenario, and as someone who ran those previous editions, I can tell you they became a nightmare. The elegance of 5th edition is in its simplicity, and to aid in this design is the empowerment of DMs to make a final call as to the rules. Now, there's a massive caveat to this rule, however, and that is only, and I mean only, that is to be used to keep the flow of the game going at the table. This is absolutely not to give DMs permission or an excuse to go on a power trip. This is only to be used in a situation that comes up where a ruling needs to be made, and the choices are either to stop the game entirely and spend time looking the rules up, or to just make a ruling on the fly in order to quickly continue. In this situation, the rules empower the DM to make a ruling only in order to keep the game going. At my table, I treat this rule with a very heavy respect, and as such, if I make a call during a game that I'm unsure of, I always do two things. First, I will do everything reasonable to err on the side of my players. I may be role-playing the enemies, but I never want my players to feel that it's me against them. We're all in this to play together and have fun. Secondly, after the game, I go look up the rule, and if it's different than what I called at the table, I let my players know ASAP. The rules are not meant to be kept secret, so if my judgment was incorrect, I feel that I need to own that as fast as I can, so I can make any corrections needed. And once again, they are made in favor of my players. They are the heroes of the story, and more importantly, you all win when everyone is having a good time. And that's it, the 6 core rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Thank you so much for hanging out here with me in the dungeon. If you've been enjoying these tutorial videos, go ahead and hit the like button below, and consider subscribing to the channel. You can also hit the bell icon below so you don't miss any of House of Crit's videos, like our campaign. We've been playing through the Lost Mine of Phandelver, and I'd love for you to join us. Next week, we're covering the central part of every character in D&D, the abilities. See you soon.